Welcome to the Diplowoman podcast, where we will be talking with and about incredible women mediators, facilitators, negotiators, ambassadors, peacemakers, peace builders, and more. I am Karma Ekmekji, and I will be your host in this journey of mainstreaming the women, peace, and security agenda into our lifestyles. With a focus on the Arab region, the Diplowoman podcast comes to you in collaboration with the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, and is made possible by the generous support of UN Women. The Arabic subtitled video edition is available on the Diplowoman podcast YouTube channel. We're thinking out loud with Dr. Lina Abi Rafeh in this new episode of the Diplowoman podcast. Lina is an award-winning global women's rights expert. She's an author, speaker, a former humanitarian aid worker with 25 years of experience on the front lines of some of the world's deadliest conflicts. She's a senior advisor for global women's rights at the Arab Institute for Women at the Lebanese American University, where she served as its executive director for 7 years. Lina, thank you for being with us today on the Diplowoman podcast.
Thank you, I'm delighted.
I don't know where to start with you. You've done so much, and I have so many questions to ask you. But actually, where I want to start is how you got into all of this. What inspired you to become a champion, a fighter, an activist, this expert on women's rights issues, and to carry this banner throughout your journey?
Well, I think being born into a female body is enough of a start. You are thinking as a girl that the world just doesn't see you as equal, and you're reminded so often in your childhood, in your adolescence, as a teenager, as a young woman, that the world just doesn't look at you the same. And so for me, I caught onto those messages from the very beginning. I feel like I was born into this because I internalized so much of that inequality and inherent injustice. So that was really the start for me, the sense that I knew that the world saw me as less than because I was born female. And the sense that I had to do something to correct it. So I guess you could say I was an angry little kid. And I didn't, this probably doesn't come as a surprise, but I didn't have the language for it. I didn't understand what was happening or why I felt the way I did until I was in high school. So I actually was still quite young. I was 14 and I was in a class in the US called Comparative Women's History. And I said, well, I'm a woman and I'd like to learn about my history. But what happened was not the history of women overall, but the history of violence against women, because our story is so much one of violence and exploitation and abuse. And I couldn't. It set off a bomb in my stomach, and it's my life never been the same. So now, over 30 years later, I'm still angry about the same things and still fighting the same things.
We're going to talk about that anger. We're going to talk some more about that anger and how you channel it into some of the amazing work that you do. So we know what the trigger was, but what were your entry points? I know I have so many people who come to me and ask, how can we get into this field? How can we make a difference?
Oh, yes.
What was the door that was opened? Or what door did you open? Or did you barge in to start?
That's great. I think that's so important. People ask me that a lot as well. And I have to say, back then, and now it sounds like 100 years ago, it wasn't as formalized as it is now. There weren't any training programs really, and kind of mentorship and all of that stuff. So I had to make it up as I went along. And what I did from a very early age, so I started in high school, I started writing papers and doing research and investigating on my own. And everything I did in the classroom at that time, I just overlaid a feminist framework onto it. So if I was studying, world history or whatever course I had to take, I looked at it through the lens of women. Or if I was studying English literature, I did that through the lens of women. So already I was teaching myself how to understand that perspective. And then when I was old enough, I started to volunteer. So I found organizations, domestic at first, like the National Organization for Women. So I was really active in pro-choice movements at that time in the States. You see where they've gotten us today. That's another subject.
That's another whole podcast episode.
That's a whole podcast. I know what's going on here is a whole podcast. But all of that to say, I started to volunteer. So I built up an understanding of what doing feminism looked like, since I understood, or I was beginning to grow my kind of being feminism. And then when I could, I just started to get fellowships and internships and overseas opportunities, and one thing led to another, and I really just like pushed my way through the door and kicked down the door. And for me, I felt like there wasn't really anybody to show me how to do it. So I do feel like I made it up, and my time in the field was really where I learned absolutely everything. It wasn't in classrooms in the end. But one lesson I got very firmly from all of that was that I would not only leave the door open, but I would reach my hand back and pull in as many people as I could. And so that's what I do. And I think now maybe it's a little bit easier. It's a bit more formalized. There are systems, there are trainings, there are online courses, there are graduate programs in this. We didn't even there was no field of study for doing this kind of work, working on women's rights, working on women, peace, and security. No, there wasn't any kind of degree that you can get in that. You just threw yourself into a job and figured it out. The formalization of the sector is a very good thing. And we have standards and we have guidelines and we have more people who are interested and we have a common language and we have clear protocols. All of that stuff is important. But there's also the risk when you reduce things to a kind of acronym. We talk about women, peace, and security, and I constantly have to remind people that I speak to that this is not the WPS agenda, that is a tick box, a to-do list, a UN campaign, just another thing that old men in the field will roll their eyes back and say, oh boy, here she goes. No, this is a no-brainer. The fact that we actually have to say women, peace, and security, to me is ironic and almost comical and makes no sense, because there is no peace and no security without women. So this, like the WPS agenda, or what I used to do, gender-based violence, GBV work, the acronyms almost undermine the power and purpose and the essence of what we're trying to do. So, there's a danger as well.
But of course, there's also a debate around that. I mean, had there been no agenda, had there been no acronym, a lot of people out there would have not even thought about this, So, I mean, I see your point about, it has to be a non-brainer. It has to be a non-issue. Of course, there's no peace and security without women, but it's fascinating to see how many people didn't even think about it. Like, it didn't even click for probably more than half of the population.
It still doesn't. It's unbelievable how often I have to explain why women are essential, are central to every aspect of our life. How do I even have to have this argument with people? I think that's what baffles me now that I'm old and crusty, is that I just don't understand why I keep having to have the same conversation, that we have to constantly justify our existence and our space over and over again in the face of setbacks. If you asked 14-year-old Lina, where would we be in 30 plus years? I would have not imagined here. I mean, I was sitting there, this angry kid reading Handmaid's Tale, thinking, wow, that's crazy. That's never going to happen.
But it's funny you mentioned that. It's funny what you said about, looking back or looking forward. I know, Lina, that you're working on a book and you're looking back at 50 years of Arab feminism. Tell us a little bit about this book. Where are you at this stage with your research? Of course, we're talking here about the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. We're talking about the Arab world. How does this all tie in with your book?
Well, the book, like all the books I've written, like everything I've written, starts out as a curiosity. As a social scientist, I'm nosy by nature. Like it starts
with a rant, and then it starts.
Well, then, I feel like it sits in my stomach. Like, I have to know why, like, what's going on here? I'm just like constantly curious about things. So, and not always in good ways, but what was curious for me in a good way when I moved to Beirut in 2015 was young women's and young people's activism and energy and feminism, even though they didn't really call it that. There was a lot of kind of movement and energy and anger, and it was organic and it was intersectional and it was regional, and there was something really, really cool about it. And so I started to kind of explore that. And so that ultimately led to this book where I wanted to zoom out and take a long and wide and regional view to understand what the dynamics are, what has led us to this uncomfortable place, because we're not really in a good place, not in Lebanon, not anywhere in the region, I would safely argue. And what does that mean for what the next 50 years are going to look like? Like, I am the least patient person in the world. So, if I'm sitting around being like, it's okay, we're going to do this, we're going to take our time, I'm pulling out my hair. I mean, I'm the last person to tell you, Male, like, it's going to be slow, but we're going to get there. And, I used to tell my team, dig me from the grave and let me know how we're doing, because I believe I'll be long dead by the time we get anywhere that I would like. I mean, that doesn't mean that I'm going to not push and fight and want to fast forward this, but you can't fast forward social change, and that's what's excruciating. I often wonder what life would have been like if I went into another field where there were actually results. But that's also a podcast for now. I know, then I could just work at a coffee shop, then I'd like, you want a coffee? I make you coffee. Here it is. I feel like I've done something with my day. Instead, I have to be long dead to see the results. But having said that, it's true. Like, we're going to have to take a long view. It is going to take a very long time to achieve any kind of goals. And I do think that young people, I mean, the region is overwhelmingly young, right? Yes. And they're the ones who are going to take it and do it. And they're the ones who are going to finish it, and I keep saying they're going to get this right. We maybe gave them shoulders to stand on. We messed it up sometimes. But, the point is that they're the ones that are going to take it forward and get it done for us. And I'm going to be applauding from the grave. That at least is my plan, my posthumous plan.
When can we expect the book?
The book in the spring, I hope. Definitely, but definitely by the summer. Yeah. So it's been really exciting because it's an investigation into speaking with, I don't want to categorize people as young and old, and I put myself in the latter category, so don't worry. But, I spoke to a full range of people. I have a co-author who is amazing as well, and she and I have been just out doing surveys and having conversations. I feel like this book is really just conversations that I have with my friends and colleagues in my daily life anyway. There's nothing particularly unusual about these conversations because I have them all the time. But to be able to document them, to build on the voices of people who are on the front lines, so to speak, people like yourself who are doing this amazing work and raising awareness and working with young people and changing minds and opening people's eyes. Once your eyes are open to these kinds of things, right, you can never close them again. And so there's a little bit of like magic and wizardry in that kind of thing. And I love it. I think it's great. So, just capturing all those conversations, it really is, the book itself is quite easy because it's so rich in terms of the quotes and stories and data. And
it's anecdotal.
Very much so, because people, this is personal, right? I mean, when we're talking about equality and justice and rights and dignity, it is about us. It's about us as individuals, as families, as communities, as countries. It becomes very, very painful because it is so personal. And I love that about the stories that people have shared and the quest that they're on, and how they share that same kind of anger. And I also wanted to build some bridges. We don't do enough in terms of our thinking as a region because of all the diversity. Well, the diversity, which is, a challenge to overcome, should also be our strength. And let's learn to kind of build those bridges and create these synergies as feminist movements, whatever we want to call them, as movements for rights and justice and equality, because we need each other, because we're not going to achieve our goals without each other.
Absolutely. Lina, you've been on the front lines of some of the deadliest conflicts, like I said, when we started. And I just want you to sort of share with us some of your impressions, some stories from those days when you worked as a humanitarian worker on the ground. What did you see were the main challenges for mainstreaming women in the peace and security agenda when you were doing that kind of work?
So I spent about 2 decades doing humanitarian emergency work and working on sexual violence prevention and response. So, an emergency is hard enough. A non-emergency is hard enough. Sexual violence is extremely difficult. And so what we know is that women and girls are already extremely vulnerable even before the emergency. And so whatever vulnerabilities they have, that is magnified hundreds of times. So everything that is bad gets much, much worse, right? And the challenge with working on sexual violence is it is hard to address. It requires a multi-sectoral response, meaning a lot of different actors have to agree to come together and do something about it. And even in so-called stable times, they don't agree. So in an emergency, that's next to impossible, and people are on the move and new forms of violence are being created, and sexual violence is extreme and it is extremely dangerous. So the work that is being done is hard and is very frustrating. Creating the space to get that work done, even within, I spent most of my career with the UN. So even with other UN colleagues to say, this is important and it needs to be addressed right now. People will always say, well, no, that's for later. And right now it's about food, it's about shelter, it's about basic needs. But if you ask any woman, and I've said this so many times, if you ask any woman, would she prefer a full belly but have her body at risk of being violated? Or, it's never such a clean choice, but the idea is most people would say they'd rather go hungry but have their bodily autonomy and integrity preserved and protected, because rape is something you just don't get over. And when there are no systems and no services and no support, even on a so-called good day, what do you do? So trying to lay a foundation that is solid in a place that is not solid is basically what I did for 2 decades. And people don't create space for it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to deal with it. Everyone from, international colleagues and people who are trying to push for humanitarian aid and support, and communities themselves who are reluctant to address it, governments who don't want to deal with it, donors who don't want to fund it. There are so many layers of disconnect, and people will say, well, how do you know it's happening? Well, it's happening everywhere. And we know that all the time. Well, how many? Why does it matter how many? At the end of the day, what's the magic number for you? Is it 1? Is it 10? Is it 1,000? Like, what's the number that's going to get you to care? Because I can assure you that number is happening. So it is a field that is very, very squishy, for lack of a better word, because we don't have even if we had numbers, those numbers are going to underestimate the reality. And this even happened, like the increase in sexual violence after an emergency happened here in the US after Hurricane Katrina, as one great example. Following the increase in sexual violence, as things start to stabilize, and I say that with a lot of irony, intimate partner violence or domestic violence increases. So also here, look at COVID as a great example of the dramatic increase in intimate partner violence that happened all around the world. So we're talking about peace and security. What peace and what security? Where? There is we exist in a state of perpetual insecurity. And those messages, I'm going to use a New York example. And I do that a lot because I really want people to understand that this happens everywhere.
It's a global war.
Absolutely. Unfortunate for me, I feel like I'll never be out of a job. When COVID first started, we got text messages here in New York saying, stay home, stay safe. And I was like, oh God, that's not going to end well. And that went on every day, 3 or 4 times a day for about 6 weeks. And at some point after 6 weeks, someone else got a hold of the text messaging and said, well, if home isn't safe for you, call this number, or don't worry, or there's help or whatever. And I thought, oh man, that's too little too late. It's very clear that the assumption that home is safe is one that is naive and irrelevant for too many women. So it's incredible. You can't even have safety and security within your own home. So our work is never going to end. It is really about changing everything from the bottom up and from the top down, all over the place, to be able to understand the risks that women face. It is a global context of patriarchy. It is manifested as misogyny. It is just active, outright violence, resentment of women and girls everywhere.
Well,
I can't believe we actually have to live like that.
To the men and women listening to us, interested in working in this field, there's a lot to do and enough work for everyone. So the entry points are there. You can reach out to us. You can tweet, write direct messages, reach out, and there's a lot of work to be done, and enough work for everyone.
Lina, if men don't get involved, we're never going to, everybody has to see this as a collective responsibility. It is ironic that, I sit here and I'm like, I'm a feminist, I'm the gender advisor, I'm the women's rights person, WPS, GBV, whatever acronym you want, and I happen to be female. No, boys, yalla. I mean, I'm serious. Guys need to actually get involved with this. They have to care, because because if women are not safe, nobody is safe. It has to be the first non-negotiable. It is the critical prerequisite for anything. You want to build, you're working on development, you're working on, I don't know, reform of economic systems or political participation. Pick your issue, doesn't matter. You are not going to succeed. You are building on sand if you do not engage women and girls from day one fully as equal humans. It's actually very simple.
Lina, what ties you to the region? You grew up in the States, studied in the States. I know you were in Lebanon for a while, but what ties you to the region? You're an Arab woman, at your core, and you do so much for the Arab world. What do you feel ties you to this region?
I think it's the bizarre dance of love and hate, right? It's this constant this pull and this push of, I'm Lebanese and Palestinian. Already that's complicated, right? I have lots of different religious backgrounds. Already that's complicated. And if there's one thing this region does, we love to put each other in very small boxes, very small national boxes, religious boxes, socioeconomic boxes. We love it. We love to keep people very tightly confined. And I just don't fit in any of those, and I think there are going to be a lot more people who are like me, who are hybrids, who are hyphenated. Here I'm Arab American, there I'm Lebanese Palestinian, and if you ask somebody else, I'm this. If you look at my last name, I'm something else. I mean, in the end, it really shouldn't matter. What actually does matter is there is so much potential in this region. There is potential that we are struggling to fulfill, but it's like we're still trying. We're still trying to give birth to what is an Arab identity? What is an Arab feminist movement or movements? What are we going to look like when we grow up is what I want to know. And that's what I find so fascinating, because we have such a great history, very far back, of having made incredible contributions to the world. I don't need to tell you, you all know what happened. What happened? Where did we kind of derail? I have some theories, but I leave it to the experts to talk about that. What has divided us? What has undermined our ability to excel? We were on a path to progress, and then we fell off it, right? And we don't have a great reputation. We really don't. I constantly am at the defense of this region because I see so much beauty there. But the reality, if you look at social indicators, is we are not doing well. We cannot deny it. We are not doing well on any measures of development or equality or progress. We have protracted crises that show no signs of stopping. We have fundamentalist movements all over the place. We have massive backlashes against any push for rights and freedom and equality. Man, I mean, there's a lot to do in this region. And I feel like if I didn't believe this region could be better, I wouldn't have gotten involved. And it was very interesting for me to take on the position I did in 2015 as executive director of the Arab Institute for Women, because I thought, this is very different from my UN work. This is going to be a deep dive into the region. This is going to be the real thing. And it was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, because I found myself so frustrated by why we were stuck. We cannot afford to progress like a Galapagos turtle. Beautiful creatures though they are a little slow. We have to do something better. We have a young population who only look to get out of the region. They see opportunities elsewhere. They see freedom and space and choice and voice elsewhere. They don't see it in the region. So what are we doing wrong? I mean, it's time to introspect quite seriously, and to also do away with a lot of the old ways and a lot of the old guard. We need a massive overhaul. It's not a matter of an election. It's, for me, it's much more dramatic than that. I really would like to see young people take charge and make a radical change. And I'll be applauding from the grave.
Maybe not from the grave.
I know, right? I've got some good years. When I speak to people, and when I also speak to myself, I have to remember that we're not going to see the changes tomorrow. It's not like one step forward, two steps. It's one step forward, 10 steps back. It's going to be extremely slow. It is an excruciating dance, but eventually it's going to have to get somewhere. Like, we cannot continue to hold each other back, repress each other, abuse each other, inflict our ways and worldviews and fundamentalisms and religions and all of that onto. We cannot get away with it anymore. People are demanding freedom. We can't breathe, literally. Like we said, we cannot breathe. So that has got to stop. But yeah, it will take a while. So I'm trying to be patient.
So Lina, you talked about how you want to see the youth in charge. That there's no alternative to the youth. We're a young society, the Arab world, 70% of the population is under 30 almost. But how do they take charge? They ask these questions like, help us, tell us, guide us. What did you do wrong so that we do it right? How can we not repeat your mistakes?
I think we really need to know what we want, right? We need to know what our critical non-negotiables are. Like, I look at all the uprisings we've had around the region, and I think, okay, this is great. People are angry. They need an outlet. What is the clear call? What's the call to action? What is the result that we want to see? Sometimes that's not so clear. Sometimes, these movements end up being moments and not movements. And that's something that, in the book, we talk about a little bit as well. The idea that people are angry, they're frustrated, they go to the streets, they want to just kind of vent. But in the end, where's the clear ask? What are we demanding? And what are we're just not going to accept anymore? And those are the things, I think we really need to work hard to build those kinds of synergies, with the different movements, because, there are those people there who want to do things better. But the problem is we get so divided with politics and personality and our, different perspectives, and certainly faith is a great divider in the region, and so many other things that keep us from finding some common denominators. And I think that's where, that's what I would like to see. And I personally, I see that in the equality agenda, right? It is about treating everybody who lives in this region the same. There is no excuse anymore for inequality. It's simply not acceptable. So how is that is it about, the numbers, getting 50% of women in parliament? Well, okay, that's one part, but that's not all. Is it about girls in school and, or opportunities and education and access? Yes, also. It's about 100 different things. But if that's our one thing that we want and we want to commit to, we've got to fight it on every single front we have. We have to fight it at home. That's the real front lines, right? It is how you operate day to day in the space that you have. I did a TEDx talk many years ago, and the theme for that talk was start where you stand. And I still use that because people say all the time, oh my God, it's so impossible to do this work because there's just too much that's bad and too much that's hard. And it's going to be impossible to achieve anything. I don't want to go to Afghanistan like you did. I can't take on this work. It's miserable. Well, all of that is true. But if you commit to starting exactly where you are in the space that you occupy, in your home or school or community or whatever, and start to change things there, things will change. And that type of behavior is contagious. People can actually see that. People can see you standing up for yourself and someone else and saying, you know what, we're going to create the space for this conversation to happen. And slowly it will happen. But I think that's the real hope that the region has. It's that, we've got to level this playing field once and for all. And I think women and girls are going to be the ones to do it. They've been held down in the region for so long and so dramatically. I mean, look at Iran, another example.
Another
Right?
podcast.
Not Arab, but like, let's spread that fire.
Dr. Lina Abi Rafeh, thank you for inspiring. Thank you for starting where you stand. And thank you for being with us today on the Diplomat podcast.
Anytime. I could go on for days. I wake up every day for this. This is what gets me out of bed. This is what keeps me going. This is the cause of my life.
And by your writings and your talks, you get other people out of bed too. I'm sure of that.
I hope so.
Thank you.
Thank you.